With the new 2022 regulations looking to reset the pecking order of the grid by changing the cars aerodynamically and introducing a cost cap, F1 are trying to entice new entrants, specifically manufacturers, into the sport to widen its appeal. There's a lot of videos about this topic, so I thought I'd do something a bit different and start a new series where I take a short view back to the past and look at where drivers, teams or bosses had a difficult time in the sport. For this episode I'll be focusing on the German car manufacturer BMW, specifically when they rejoined the grid back in 2000 after a 13-year absence, as that's where most of us remember seeing them in F1. But before I get any further into the video, I want to say hello to all my new subscribers and thank you to all the support on my recent videos. It means a lot and it motivates me to make the best content possible, so I really appreciate it. Anyway, let's take a look at where BMW went wrong. Whilst I'm focusing on BMW in the 21st century, they actually have an F1 legacy that's either forgotten about or not even known by many fans, so I thought I'd give a quick brief overview on their older F1 history. BMW's earliest F1 entries were in the 50s at the German Grand Prix in 1952 and 1953. Privateer teams used BMW cars based on their pre-war 328 chassis, but seeing as the championship at the time was effectively running Formula 2 regulations, this allowed them to take part, but they weren't very successful. Something similar happened again in the 60s as the F1 race in Germany was held at the same time as the Formula 2 race on the same circuit. They scored their best result of 10th in 1968, but unfortunately a year later driver Gerhard Mitter was fatally injured in a practice session, and it was a number of years until we saw the brand back in the sport as a manufacturer. The company came back to F1 in the 80s when the first turbocharged engines were introduced, as they saw it as a great opportunity from a marketing and sales standpoint, especially as their M brand was launching around the same time. They did a deal with Brabham to supply M12 and M13 works engines up until 1987 when team owner Bernie Ecclestone decided not to compete the following year, and in 1989 turbocharged engines were banned, so BMW once again decided to pull out of the sport. Over 8 seasons the engine was part of a relatively successful period as it had won the 1983 Drivers' Championship with Nelson Piquet, won 9 Grand Prix, took 14 pole positions and set 13 fastest laps. BMW also provided customer engines to ATS, Ligier, Benetton and Arrows, some of which were rebadged as Megatron, and Arrows scored their highest constructors' points in their history by finishing 5th in 1988. After a 13-year hiatus, BMW returned to the sport in 2000 when the V10s were in use. Now I could make a whole video on the BMW Williams link-up, so for this one I'm going to keep it as concise as possible. With Renault withdrawing as Williams' works engine supplier, BMW stepped in and took on that role as they wanted to be an integral part of the team returning to the top after a difficult couple of years. This matched the company and its image perfectly at the time as they were all about maximising performance, whilst they were also developing a road-going version of a V10 engine, the one we saw in the E60 M5. Dr. Mario Tyson was the head of BMW Motorsport at the time, and he typified the DNA of the brand, a high achiever, calm, precise and a huge fan of racing. He set out a plan that would make the BMW engine the best in F1. The partnership was supposed to bring another set of Williams dominance that was seen throughout the 90s. In the first year of the partnership, things got off to a great start. Williams came third in the championship, and BMW didn't even develop the engine that much as they prioritised reliability over performance. Yet it still had the same horsepower as the equivalent Renault engine. But in 2001, cracks in the relationship were starting to appear. Williams won 4 races which looked like solid progression, but there was much more to this than meets the eye. It became apparent that BMW had made incredible gains in just 1 year. Rumours at the time suggested that they had 100 more horsepower than the previous year, and 30 more than both Ferrari and Mercedes, whilst the engine was also smaller and lighter than the competition. Ex-Mercedes engine developer Andy Cowell was part of the team, so it doesn't surprise me that the engine was great. However, it was apparent that the car aerodynamically wasn't up to standard, mainly due to Adrian Newey leaving a gaping hole in the design department after his move to McLaren in 1997. This angered senior figures within BMW. 2002 was more of the same as they designed an engine with 900 horsepower that was the first to ever be on 19,000 RPM, but Williams were once again beat by the dominant Ferrari in its F2002. BMW were beginning to realise that they needed to control all operations to maximise their destiny. Nevertheless, they were slightly more sympathetic in 2003 as Williams were in the title race until the last couple of races. They inquired about purchasing Williams, but Frank wanted to remain independent and there was a huge culture clash at play. BMW were very well organised and structured whilst Williams were the complete opposite. After being rejected, BMW began to re-evaluate its F1 programme. 2004 and 2005 didn't help the relationship either as Williams were even less competitive than the previous years, and this was the last straw for BMW. Rapport broke down, and in June 2005 BMW announced it was buying Sauber. However, they were in for a rude awakening when stepping up to full works team status. They had many setbacks as soon as the takeover occurred. Sauber only had around 275 employees at the time, and BMW had to invest huge amounts of money to bring it in line with the top teams. They recruited aggressively and quickly, but this was proving difficult as they struggled getting in the right calibre of people without disrupting the team's family culture. One of BMW's biggest competitive advantages was taken away in 2006 as the V10s were ditched and replaced by the V8s, a move they strongly opposed as it was more constrictive to develop, whilst they only just completed their V10 road car engine. Nevertheless, BMW had a point to prove and they continued with their programme. As their 2006 car was basically a Sauber design that was dated back to 2003, they set the bar low and predicted points, but from 2007 onwards they had a plan: podiums in 2007, wins in 2008, and a fight for the championship in 2009. 2006 was a lot more successful than initially anticipated. Nick Heidfeld was brought in from Williams, and he partnered the ever-controversial Jacques Villeneuve. There were regular point scorers in the first half of the year, and Jacques, who was unwanted by the team from the outset but he had to remain for contractual reasons, departed after the German Grand Prix. He was replaced by the Polish superstar Robert Kubica. The second half of the year was even more successful, as both Heidfeld and Kubica scored podiums in Hungary and Italy respectively, and the team finished 5th in the Constructors' Championship with 36 points, an improvement on Sauber's tally of 20 the previous year. Things were looking positive as BMW increased their workforce to 600, whilst they were also able to increase the number of development hours in the wind tunnel. For 2007 the team showed a lot of promise. They were often the third fastest car, and they were only on average 5/10ths down on the top teams McLaren and Ferrari, halving their deficit compared to the previous season. Nick Heidfeld especially had a fantastic season, finishing on the podium twice in Canada and Hungary, whilst only finishing outside of the points 3 times, and 2 of those were retirements. The only real negative thing in the season was Kubica's horror accident in Canada. Thankfully he only had minor injuries and missed just 1 race, but that also gave a debut to a young 4-time world champion-to-be called Sebastian Vettel, who scored a point on his debut. They finished 2nd in the Constructors' Championship after McLaren's disqualification due to the Spygate scandal, and they scored 101 points, a massive improvement on 2006, and the signs of progression were there to see. Then, in 2008, BMW made probably the biggest error in their motorsport history. Both Ferrari, McLaren and their drivers were making mistakes, whilst Robert Kubica was incredibly consistent, especially in the initial stages of the season. In the first 8 races he finished in the top 5 7 times, including 3 podiums in Malaysia, Bahrain and Monaco, and then he won an incredible race in Canada where Lewis Hamilton hit Kimi Raikkonen in the pit lane. He left that race leading the championship, and it was highly possible that with his current form he could win the title, but BMW had other ideas. New regulations were being brought in for 2009, and the senior management team decided that rather than continue the development of the 2008 car, they fully focused on 2009. You could argue it was the correct thing to do as they were showing fantastic progression each season, and due to the road changes being probably the biggest the sport had ever seen, they gambled that they could win the championship the following season. Kubica was rightly annoyed, and the performances after Canada increased his anger. By the end of the season, BMW was at times only the 5th fastest car, but Robert was still mathematically in the title race until the penultimate race of the season. However, even though he put in some outstanding performances, he ended up 3rd in the championship. So going into 2009, you would think that all the early development work BMW did would pay off. Unfortunately, that couldn't be any further from the truth. They set the bar high to win the championship due to one part of the new regulations that they focused on the most, KERS, the Kinetic Energy Recovery System. The only issue was that KERS was incredibly heavy, and there were also other loopholes in regulations such as the double diffuser that would provide much more performance for less money. All of this led to BMW embarrassing themselves and having an uncompetitive car for the whole season. Kubica didn't even use KERS for the first 3 races due to his weight, but other than an exceptional race in Australia where he qualified 2nd but collided with Sebastian Vettel late in the race, he only scored 1 podium in Brazil. Both cars were often out in Q1 and didn't even finish in the top 10. So at Silverstone, team principal Mario Tyson announced they would stop development of KERS and focus more on aerodynamics. What made things even more embarrassing for the team was that although Ferrari and McLaren had early struggles with the system, by the end of the season they were very competitive. Finishing behind them was bad enough, but mass market manufacturer Toyota and old partner Williams were beating them, which only compounded BMW's misery. By the end of the season they finished 6th in the championship with 36 points, but unfortunately their time in F1 was up. The BMW board had a meeting earlier on in the season, and after scheduling a press conference on July the 29th, they announced they would leave the sport at the end of 2009. Chairman Norbert Reithofer said it was a strategic decision taken at a corporate level, but combining the poor results on track with the worldwide economic collapse of 2008, it was understandable why the decision was made. Toyota did the same thing. Being a manufacturer is very expensive, and BMW spent a lot of resources for 2009, but they didn't meet their high expectations. In hindsight, their choice to stop developing their 2008 car midway through the season was catastrophic, and if Kubica won the Drivers' Championship they might not have pulled out of F1 at the end of 2009. Peter Sauber repurchased the team at the end of the year, and as the famous saying goes, the rest is history. So that was a little backstory into why BMW ultimately failed in F1. I would love to see them and other manufacturers participate in the sport when the new regulations come in, but unfortunately, they've already announced that they're not interested in joining the grid in the near future, but with the direction that F1 is going in, I hope this changes. I believe they have unfinished business in the sport that needs addressing. Anyway, I know this has been a much longer video than usual, so if you stayed until the end, I hope you've learned something new. I definitely did when researching for it. As always, if you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications of when my videos drop. And if you want to hear from me more regularly, go follow me on Twitter. My link is in the description below. Anyway guys, thanks again and I'll see you in the next one.